Hi, my name is Cindy Kleckner, and I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I'm here today with the Texas Beef Council to showcase beef. I've always known that cooking for people was my love language and have a sincere desire to inspire. My culinary skills have evolved over the course of my years as a culinary dietitian, and cooking is something that I'm passionate about. It brings me joy. My personal goal is to simplify the process of choosing beef cuts and help you become a culinary globetrotter in your own kitchen. Once you master planning and prep, it becomes effortless. The work is front-loaded. Chopping, measuring, pre-prep, all done in advance is the key. No more 1-800 takeout. The pandemic, wildfires, hurricanes, winter storms, and social unrest have had an enormous impact on our food culture, uncovering food access and healthcare inequities and changing how consumers shop and cook. It's so important for dietitians to understand consumer attitudes, the impact on the food industry, and the ways that we can be of greatest help. Cooking became the #1 activity during the lockdown as a comfort, distraction, entertainment, and a way to connect with others. Scratch cooking and batch cooking increased along with online grocery shopping. Home cooks were and still are interested in trying new cooking techniques and recipes. Some of the methods of saving money, and some just wanting to replicate the experience of luxury restaurants at home through immersive culinary experiences. The International Food Information Council of 2020 showed that 82% of respondents said that the pandemic shifted what we eat and how they purchase, and 50% are more likely to cook meals from scratch. We need to capitalize on this eating habit shift. Disruptions in the supply chain have elevated the urgency of sustainability. Food waste is a more urgent issue with consumers wanting to learn more about where their food comes from and ingredients that would otherwise be thrown out. Racial tensions spilled over to the food world from cries of consumers' desire to learn more about culturally appropriate food to petitions to remove racist brands. There is a need for diversity and cultural respect. As registered dietitians, we have an opportunity to fuel consumers' desire to be more food involved, to help them with shopping and cooking with purpose, and also supporting their interest in preventive health and self-care. Here are a few tips to help with those cooking roadblocks. For juggling time at work, time with family, and doing self-care, the biggest obstacle to getting dinner on the table is extra time to prep. That's why relying on store-bought shortcuts come in handy. Packages of pre-chopped and trimmed vegetables, frozen chopped aromatics like mirepoix, pre-washed and cut bags of greens, and stew meat and cubed meat really comes in handy. There's no shame in these conveniences to save time. If it means that life is easier and that you can get a meal on the table during that 6 o'clock scramble. Failing to plan is planning to fail. Menu planning is essential. This should be the #1 goal to help clients. Sketch out meal ideas while making grocery lists, help families get organized, promotes healthier choices, saves time and money, and prevents the mealtime frenzy. It's important to create staple lists for the pantry, refrigerator, and also freezer of items that you always keep on hand for quick meals, especially in the time of crisis and lockdowns. These 2 items alone are most important in helping consumers succeed. When money is tight, it's really important to consider budget-friendly food, especially beef cuts that are really affordable and that can be easily prepped and flavored. Watch for sales and stock up. Be mindful of right-sized portions. And also, taking some online classes or getting ideas of technique and food preparation are really, really important to increase your culinary skills. The websites like www.beeflovingtexans.com is amazing, and I highly recommend that you share that with your consumers and your clients. Standing over the meat case can be so overwhelming. Texas Beef Council was here to help. Whether a weeknight-friendly sheet pan beef dinner or a prize special occasion prime rib, beef is special and a real privilege to eat. It's a nourishing gift, one that provides powerful protein and 10 essential nutrients. You know, all cattle spend a majority of their lives eating grass on pastures. There's a lot that goes into bringing meat from pasture to your plate. Here's what we look for. These grades are assigned by the USDA. The USDA grade shields are highly regarded as symbols of safe, high-quality American beef. It's really the language used within the beef industry, and everyone from those involved in buying to marketing ag products benefit from it. The U.S. meat production system is one of the most well-developed and heavily regulated food production systems in the world. We should feel so proud to have the safest and highest quality food. Beef is graded in two ways. Quality grades for tenderness, juiciness, and flavor, and yield grades for the amount of usable lean meat on the carcass. What does this mean for the consumer? Prime beef is produced from young, well-fed cattle. It has the most marbling, which is that fat that's interspersed with the lean meat and mostly sold to restaurants, but a lot of higher-end grocery store chains and also specialty meat markets. Then we have the choice beef, which is also very high quality, but less marbling than the prime. And then there's the select beef, which is very uniform in quality and usually leaner than the higher grade. But the most important thing to know is where they come from on the carcass and how to prepare and cook various cuts of meat so they can all be tender, juicy, and flavorful. If you've ever been on a meat locker tour, you can relate to the oohing and awing of the rows of rib and drop loins in cooler racks. And if you haven't been on a tour, I highly recommend it. Aging is the process during which the microbes and enzymes act on the meat to help break down the connective tissue to make the meat more tender. It can happen in a bag or in the air. During wet aging, beef is actually aged in the plastic, and 90% of the beef purchased for home use is wet aged. Dry aging allows the meat to breathe, lose water, and get acted upon by the microbes besides those of the muscle itself. Some people say they associate the taste and texture of well-aged meat with a true steakhouse experience. What you buy is a very personal experience. The customer is always right. You can spend time studying this chart and memorize the facts, but it makes more sense when you do it in small bites. No one starts with the whole cow. The amount of exercise a particular muscle gets determines the flavor and tenderness of the meat that it produces. Knowing where on the animal your meat comes from tells you a lot about how you can cook it and what results you can expect. Learn a little basic mammal anatomy and you'll be a much more informed shopper. All you have to do is understand a handful of simple concepts about what makes a piece of meat more or less tender. You'll be empowered to choose meat for any occasion. Think about your own body. Exercised muscles are firmer and supporting muscles are tender. A beef carcass is actually divided into 8 primal cuts and well over 30 retail cuts. The tender cuts come from the muscle groups that get the least amount of exercise, which runs along the back of the cattle, the tender middle. The less tender cuts of meat are from the areas that move and support the body. As the muscle is exercised, its fibers take on protein, making the muscle bigger, redder, and more flavorful. At the same time, its connective tissue thickens and becomes more elastic, which makes the muscle harder and less tender. You can see how this affects the cooking method that you choose. This comprehensive chart has everything you want to know about beef, the various cuts of beef, where they come from on the carcass, and the recommended cooking method for each. Just because a recipe calls for a specific cut of meat doesn't mean you have to use it. Many cuts are interchangeable as long as they fall into the same general category. Let's take a break a minute and look at some of those different cuts so you can really see what they're all about. I want to show you some more tender cuts. This happens to be a nice T-bone steak. You can see the little T-bone. And I also have a tenderloin. And you can see on this T-bone, there's a little bit of that tenderloin in there, and that's where it comes from on the animal. There's some fat in here with wonderful marbling. But as you can see on the tenderloin, you barely have a lot of fat, and it's very versatile, but it is a little bit more expensive. The way I like to use tenderloin is in a kebab or doing skewers. That way you don't have to use a lot of the beef because of the price tag, but you get to enjoy the more expensive cut of beef. There's also another one that I enjoy, and that's the ribeye. This happens to be a very slim cut of a ribeye, but you can see all the marbling throughout. But I want you to see how there's a variety of choices and also price points. I also like to take my tenderloin and use them as a kebab, so cutting them into pieces. And when you're trying to portion out a smaller portion of meat, like 3 or 4 ounces, you don't feel cheated on your plate. Now I want to compare these well marbled meats to something like a flank steak. When you look at this, there is some fat on here, but there's so much connective tissue that it needs something to break it down a little bit, such as a marinade, or like I did here, cutting it into smaller pieces, which allows you to do some stir fry or pan searing, and that will take care of some of the problems that you might have with that connective tissue. So these are just some of the different options. Now this would be considered a less tender cut of meat, and so is the flat iron steak. So when you're using these, you can use the dry cooking methods, but you may need a little bit of tenderizer to do a dry heat method of cooking. But I just wanted to give you an example and show you how the proper cooking techniques and flavorings and how you manipulate the meat is really going to matter with these cooking techniques. As you can see here, this has a lot of texture, and so when I'm cutting it, I always want to cut it against the grain to make it a little bit more easy to chew. So there's a lot of different ways to manipulate every price point, whatever your budget can afford, and they can still be juicy, tender, and wonderfully delicious. We also have probably the most popular form of beef, and that's the ground meat. And you can manipulate this so many ways by adding different spices and herbs and cooking techniques. Now I'd like to show you the difference between a steak and a roast. And as you can see, the roast is a lot thicker, and you can see the connective tissue and the fat. When I prepare anything using this chuck roast, I like to trim the fat either before or during the cooking. So this, you can tell, needs a lot more cooking, like braising or stewing, and you need some sort of liquid to break down that connective tissue. On the other hand, we have two wonderful steak options. One is the T-bone, and we also have the tenderloin. And with these, you can use a drier method of cooking, and these are maybe a tad more expensive, but again, you have so many options. Not all cuts are created equal. When you know how tender the cut of meat is, you can learn how to properly cook it. Cooking methods impact the tenderness, flavor, and juiciness of beef. Applying the correct cooking method and right time and flavor will bring out the meat's best potential. Depending on your needs, some cuts are better than others. When cooking any kind of meat, practice is always the best teacher. Touching, observing, and monitoring helps you be more in tune with your ingredients and the process. The Beef Loving Texans website has amazing resources to pair your meat with any preparation method. Most beef cuts are not butter knife tender, but there are ways for resourceful cooks to enhance the quality. All of them manipulate the connective tissue that binds the meat fibers. Less tender cuts are from the areas that move and support the body: the chuck, brisket, plate, flank, and round. Slow cooking is the most common and effective way to break down that connective tissue gradually until the meat just falls apart, very tender. And you can do that slow cooking by simmering. You can smoke it for hours. You can mechanically tenderize it before cooking by pounding it or scoring it or piercing it. You can also slice cuts very thin, like what you would do for stir frying, or grinding it as in ground meat. There are many ways to display similar information, as you can see in this chart. The best tip is just to do it. just to try these things. Meat is mainly muscle, right? To figure out whether it'll melt in your mouth or take some more chewing, think about what that muscle did during the animal's life. You can predict the cut's tenderness by measuring its distance from that sweet and tender spot in the middle of the animal's back. As you move down and outward, the meat gradually is less tender. Hard-working muscles contain more collagen, a protein that connects muscle fibers together and keeps them attached to the bone. Connective tissue is much chewier than muscle tissue, so more collagen means less tender meat. So less tender cuts definitely have their strength. So think about a really nice brisket that has an ample collagen amount that gradually breaks down into a silky, delicious gelatin when you braise it. That hunk of meat is transformed into a succulent, flavorful dish. We're talking today about different cuts of meat, and this particular recipe uses one of the less tender cuts of meat, like a chuck roast. And we're making a wonderful Tuscan pot roast. It uses a meat that has a lot of connective tissue, so you need to do a braise, and that means adding some liquid in the form of water, wine. Today I actually use tomatoes, and the acidity of the tomatoes really helps to break through that connective tissue and make a tender, succulent pot roast. This happens to be an Italian twist on a pot roast, which uses some wonderful Italian tomatoes. But you start the dish by adding flavor. First, I took the beef and added it to a really hot pot with a little bit of oil to sear to get a really nice brown crust. That's the first flavor. Then I added the mirepoix, which would be your celery, your carrots, and your onions chopped up. Added that to the liquid that was already in the pan to make a wonderful, delicious caramelized vegetable dish. Then I added the beef back in, added some tomatoes, and let this cook for at least an hour and a half to 2 hours. And what you have is a wonderful, delicious, melt-in-your-mouth piece of chuck roast that you normally would not be able to chew through as easy if you tried to grill it or even seared it in a pan. So today, we're going to take this wonderful pot roast and we're going to serve it with some pappardelle noodles like you would if you were having this meal in Italy. This is a wonderful dish that many times is used as the first course, because what I did was I took the meat out and I chopped it into smaller pieces as opposed to one whole big piece. So many times in Italy they serve the first dish as a meat with a wonderful sauce that was created during the cooking process with all these wonderful vegetables. So you can see how delicious and also nutritious this meal could really be. If you didn't want to use the pappardelle noodles, I highly recommend polenta, which is also a whole grain, which would be a wonderful alternative. I'm going to add a little bit of color to this just to make it a lot more palatable. So we're going to take some fresh Italian parsley and chop that over the top and give that some actual color, but it's also going to add some flavor to this wonderful dish. There you go. So there we have it, a wonderful Tuscan pot roast that brings a less tender cut of meat to a succulent dish that's really butter knife delicious. Tender cuts come from the muscle groups that get the least amount of exercise, which run along the back of the animal. That's the rib, the short loin, and the sirloin. With cuts from the tender middle section, you can use fast cooking methods that create tasty surface browning while cooking the interior as quickly as possible. Here's another chart to identify the cut and cook options for more tender meat. Tender meats usually have only one uniform muscle or as few muscles within the cut as possible. Multiple muscles indicate a greater amount of connective tissue. Let's take a minute and look at the next recipe, which is rosemary skewered beef. What I'd like to highlight with this recipe is a very tender cut of meat called the tenderloin, and it's absolutely melt in your mouth delicious. To make it a little more affordable, we're doing some skewered beef today, some skewered tenderloin, and this one is jam-packed with flavor because we're using the evergreen rosemary as a skewer. So it's going to infuse that wonderful evergreen flavor into the meat. First, I'm going to take a little bit of Dijon mustard and dress my meat with the Dijon mustard. Be very generous with that. This is just going to add one more layer of flavor. I'm going to take salt and pepper, and I like to use the coarse, freshly ground pepper, and I'm going to take some of my leaves that I've chopped up from the rosemary and mix the two of those together. And now I'd like to sprinkle those very generously on my beef. And you don't even have to let that sit or marry the flavors. It's going to all come together really well because we're going to pan sear it in a very hot skillet with a little bit of oil. That's the beauty of really tender meat, getting that skillet really hot, putting a little bit of oil, and getting a nice crusty brown flavor. But with this particular dish, you have so many things going on. So what we're going to do is take each of these little pieces of beef and we're going to skewer those onto the piece of rosemary. And you might have to fight with it a little bit, but you can see how fun this would be for a nice little party. Now we're going to cut away to the stove and just sear these on a very high heat until they're wonderfully brown crusted. I have my cast iron skillet already heating because you want to get your skillet good and hot before you add your oil. You don't want to force it, you don't want to rush it. You want to be sure that that oil gets good and hot, and I always like to say that it talks back to you. You want to hear that delicious sizzle. There you go. My goal here is to have that brown crusty outside called the Maillard reaction. That's going to give me that browning effect that is such a wonderful flavor enhancer to any dish. And I'm going to try to brown all four sides. So I'm just giving this an opportunity to heat up. But one thing I do want to mention is that the internal temperature of this dish should be 145 degrees, because that is the only way to determine safe beef temperatures. If you're looking at it or if you're touching it, that doesn't give you necessarily the right temperature. If you wanted to make this dish a full meal, you can certainly skewer it on a kebab skewer with some wonderful little potatoes, little yellow potatoes. You can use whole new red potatoes. And then I just drizzle a little bit of olive oil and the same spices that I did on the skewers. Small pieces of meat that are cooked as an appetizer size, or a nice kebab with colorful vegetables. Pairing beef with vegetables is a wonderful way to go, just to get a full, well-balanced meal. People know a little bit about nutrition from the popular press, but have a problem making it work for them. That's where dietitians and cooking comes in. A beautiful stir fry of lean beef seared to a delicious perfection with garlic and ginger, paired with a variety of colorful vegetables and a side of whole grain rice. Now that's a nutritional winner. Multiple food groups, color, quick prep, and cook times, oh so delicious. KISS, which is keeping it simple, is every cook's dream. The age-old campfire foil pouch meal is elevated to the sheet pan dinner and one skillet meals, perfect for those time crunches. So let's take a minute and look at those foil pouch meals and sheet pan dinners. So we're going to assemble these wonderful little foil pouches, which is a quick and easy meal idea. It's that keeping it simple that's important. And I picked sirloin today because it gives you that beefy, rich flavor that's going to be tender enough that you can actually bake these foil pouches in the oven. So I have my wonderful Yukon Gold potatoes, little baby ones, and I'm going to cut those in half, or quarters actually, and pop those in a bowl. And then chop up other vegetables. This is your opportunity to do some wonderful pairings with beef, because beef pairs so well with so many different veggies. So I have my potatoes, I have my carrots that are already cut up. Here's some onions that are sliced, and also some red bell peppers, which are wonderful in terms of vitamin C. And then I have some garlic that's already been minced. And I'm just going to mix all these together. with my beef, of course. And I'm going to toss together these items, but where's the flavor? I have to add some wonderful flavor. So I'm going to be doing some garlic powder, some parsley, and some oregano. So I'm just going to toss those in. And add a little bit of oil. And I'm choosing some canola today, but you can obviously use extra virgin olive oil. And you just toss these together. These are packets that you can make ahead of time. It makes it really quick and easy. Now I'm going to take a piece of aluminum foil that's heavy duty so that nothing leaks through it. And I have a nice little square that I'm going to throw all these different ingredients into that aluminum foil. This turned out to be a pretty big one, so I can actually feed a couple people with this, but that's the beauty of using veggies. So I'm going to take this and create a little tent. So put the pieces of foil together and just kind of turn them over so that I have my tent in there so that when I put this in the oven, it's going to steam. All the meat and the veggies are going to steam cooked. Close down the sides, and I still have my little tent. Then I take my little tray and put this in the oven for about 20 to 25 minutes on 425 degrees, and you're good to go. Now you can make these packets ahead of time and save yourself some time when you get home from work or maybe when you get into that time crunch. But this is a real easy way to have a great meal for everyone, and you can create different flavor profiles and also use different vegetables. Here's one that we just popped out of the oven. So you can see what it looks like on our wonderful plate, and you can even serve it with the foil, just like you would if you were around the campfire. There we go. Very easy, very delicious, and very filling too. And you have that wonderful beef flavor. Flavor is the biggest factor influencing food choices of any kind. Consumers care a great deal about flavor and are not willing to, nor should they, sacrifice flavor for nutrition. The American palate has become bolder over the years because of the global nature of our society. When you look at trends, today's recipes have much more intense flavor than 25 years ago. Bold, ethnic flavors, hot, spicy, sweet, and sour are much more common. Consumers are transitioning from thinking low calorie, low fat to wholesome food with that emphasis on flavor. We experience taste as our taste buds detect bitter, sweet, sour, salt, and umami. All of our senses, including smell and touch and taste, sight and sound, all work together to create that complex sensation that we call flavor. Healthy cooking should balance the 5 tastes by mixing and matching ingredients to produce taste, aroma, texture, temperature, and visual impact. We first eat with our eyes. A good meal creates a party in your mouth and a symphony on your tongue. Salty, which is, salt or sodium chloride, is one of the most overused flavor enhancers, which is really important when you're cooking beef. But it's important to think about how you can reduce salt in recipes, and one of the examples might be to use monosodium glutamate, which is 1/3 of the sodium of salt. You can also use other ingredients such as capers and bacon and prosciutto as a flavor enhancer to eliminate some of the salt. Bitter, defined as an acrid, sharp, and unpleasant taste, stimulates the appetite and sometimes can actually cut through some of the richness of food. Think about a delicious cooked collard or a kale salad that's kind of bitter, that kind of goes along with a wonderful grilled piece of steak. Another one is sweet. We're kind of born for that strong desire for sweet. And instead of using the basic sugar, you can always use ingredients such as currants with ground beef, or maybe even chopped up raisins. That would be a good choice. Sour, the basic taste of sour, comes from acidic ingredients that provide bright and very sharp flavors that can reduce the need for salt. They can add flavor, but they can also tenderize meat. One of our recipes, we're going to use cider vinegar to act as a flavoring agent for the Caribbean jerk flat iron steak. Umami is actually a Japanese word meaning delicious, sometimes described as savory, brothy, or meaty. So ever so subtle are these notes that they can turn a dish from ho-hum to yum. The nose sets up our taste expectations. In fact, the perceived flavor of food is primarily influenced by smell. Mouthfeel is very important because it really helps us to get satisfied longer. Think about the crunchiness and crispiness that adds to our textural appeal, such as like a grilled beef with an avocado, cranberry, and maybe a jalapeno salsa. Temperature also affects the flavor experience. Thinking about adding like a chili to a dish that's hot and seasons your food, but it also adds a lot of antioxidants and some deliciousness to that meal. When we're talking about the art of flavor, smell is so important, but so are so many other properties. Now let's take a look at the art of flavor. One of my favorite chili recipes has quite a few different varieties of flavor. So here we have some wonderful ground meat and also some stew meat for this recipe, which is my favorite in-your-face chili. Now, chili is one of those wonderful things that we love here in Texas, but what makes this one so unique is not only the two kinds of beef, but I also have beef chorizo in here, but it has every seasoning but the kitchen sink. I have, as you can see, some oregano, some cumin, some garlic powder. I have some chili powder in here, and another secret ingredient to add wonderful flavor to beef is actually cinnamon. It gives you a little bit of a sweet note, but it adds such wonderful flavor. It also has a little bit of a pungency, and you can add as much heat or as little as you want. I actually like to score my jalapeno and throw it in my chili while it's cooking, and that gives you some wonderful flavor. The main thing, since I'm using stew meat, is I'm gonna have to cook this longer than 20 minutes. So I usually like to put it on for about an hour to an hour and a half, and then I add my beans, and then I cook it for another 30 minutes. And I'm using dark kidney beans because that's personally one of my favorites. So you can see this wonderful chili is very robust and flavorful, and we're gonna serve this up with a wonderful piece of cornbread. And this chili is nice and thick because I've used some masa harina to really kind of tighten it up. So here's my wonderful chili, and I'm going to decorate this with a little bit of cheese and some sour cream. We have our wonderful jalapenos, and I even like to throw in a little bit of tart with the lime, a little slice of lime. So there you have it, some wonderful chili for, you know, watching football or maybe just cozying up with a fire and a nice book. Raw food tastes completely different when it's cooked. Compare the taste of a raw onion to one that's been caramelized with a little bit of oil and a slow cooking saute. It's so much better. Another reaction that we talk about is a browning effect called the Maillard reaction. It occurs when heat is applied to food that contains both carb and protein, identified by that browning and that wonderful development of flavor. The browning of sugar is a reaction called caramelization. So when we're talking about beef, for instance, we want to keep it dry. So we always want to wipe it with paper towel so that we can generate that wonderful heat and the browning effect. Traditional sautéing is a dry heat method using fat and medium to high heat, using delicate food that cooks quickly. Searing is a variation of sautéing, and it calls for browning food on all sides in a very hot pan to develop that brown, wonderful crust. Let's take a look at that Maillard reaction in real life and look at the recipe that we're going to do today called easy bulgogi. This particular meat is called a skirt steak, traditionally known as fajita steak meat. And it has a lot of fibers in it, so I've cut it up into smaller pieces, which makes it a little tender, more tender. We're also going to do a little bit of a marinade on this dish, and this recipe is called easy bulgogi. So what we're going to do first is toss all these ingredients in a Ziploc bag so that we can marinate in the refrigerator. I'm going to put a little bit of brown sugar, some soy sauce, and a little bit of sesame oil. Sesame oil is one that is very, very flavorful from the sesame seed. It's pressed from sesame seeds. So I'm just gonna mix this all up, put in my meat slices, and let it marinate for really as long as the time that you have. Anywhere from 15 minutes to overnight. So you can see it's really easy. I'm gonna let all these flavors blend together. And I'm gonna also let this marinade do its work in tenderizing the meat. You wanna cook this on the grill, and you might need a grill pan just so that those small pieces of meat don't fall through the grate, or else you can sear it in the skillet, which is what we're gonna do today. This skillet is good and hot. I'm gonna add a little bit of oil. I'm gonna give that a little bit of time just to get that Maillard reaction going, that browning effect, which is gonna also add delicious flavor. I have my wonderfully seared skirt steak, which is seasoned just wonderful with the Asian flavors. And I'd like to turn this into a lettuce wrap just to make for easier, quicker, lighter eating. So I put my meat in the middle of my lettuce. Sprinkle a little bit of shredded carrots just to give it a pop of color, some green onions, and you could even top it with some toasted sesame seeds if you'd like, but it really makes for delicious light eating, especially in the summertime. And that's really that's all there is to this simple recipe. Now, if you didn't have a cast iron skillet, this would work really good in a wok, a stir-fry wok. And you could add any number of vegetables to it if you'd like. But this gives you a little bit of a contrast and just such good flavors. These wonderful flavoring options that you see on the slide are especially suitable to maximize the appeal of healthful food. Today we're going to talk a little bit about infusion, and that is pulling flavor out of ingredients and infusing it into foods and liquids, such as the rosemary skewered beef that we made earlier, where that wonderful rosemary, that evergreen flavor gets infused into the actual beef. Let's take a look at what a marinade looks like. We're going to do a Caribbean jerk seasoning, but using a marinade instead. This particular recipe showcases what we call a flat iron steak, which is a unique and innovative cutting method across the cow's shoulder. And it is as tender and juicy and delicious as a more expensive cut of meat, but at affordable prices. So what we're going to do is a wonderful flavor today, and it's called Jamaican jerk. It's kind of an interesting flavor component that's very, very popular in the Caribbean. And jerk is actually the name of the seasoning that is actually a blend, and it has a bunch of different seasonings in it. So you'll have a little bit of allspice and cinnamon and clove. And traditionally in the Caribbean jerk is going to be like a Scotch bonnet pepper, habanero pepper, but you can make it as sweet and spicy or as hot as you'd like. So today I'm using a jerk seasoning that you can find on your store shelves in the grocery store, and we're going to mix that with, instead of just taking the herb and rubbing it into the muscle of the meat, we're actually going to do a marinade. And today I'm using just plain old olive oil or canola, whatever you choose. We're going to add a little bit of soy sauce and also some cider vinegar. So this is going to be our wonderful marinade for this flat iron. You can also do this in a sealable Ziploc bag. And honestly, you can probably marinate it for about 15 minutes, but it's heavenly if you give it a couple hours. So I'm going to take that piece of meat, the flat iron, and if you can tell, it has a lot of grains through it. It's rather thin. You can also do this on the grill. Today I'm going to cook it on a hot skillet over the stove. So I just want to make sure that both sides are well coated with my marinade. And like I said, you can cover that and put that in the refrigerator for anywhere from 20 minutes to a couple hours, or even overnight if you'd like. Some meat, you have to be careful. If you marinate it too long, it might get mushy, but I think this meat can stand up to this wonderful marinade. My cast iron skillet is good and hot. I'm going to add some oil. Because there's a lot of surface area, it's important to just make sure that you get that good browning effect. This meat is served perfectly fine just as is, but if you're interested in pairing, this one, because of the sweet and savory nature of the seasoning, goes really well with a salsa. And today I'm going to do a wonderful mango salsa using a really ripe mango. The best way to cut into this is just hold your mango straight up, cut down through the side, and then cut your little pieces of mango right out of the skin. It's a very easy way to make everything uniform in size, because of course we eat with our eyes, so we want it to be beautifully sectioned on our plate. I'm going to add some cucumber that's already chopped up. I tend to leave the skin on mine just for extra fiber. And then we have a little bit of the red onion, some jalapeno pepper, and I'm going to add a little bit of my chopped cilantro. And this makes a wonderful pairing with beef. We have our deliciously sweet mango with the crunchy cucumber, and then a little pop of flavor from the jalapeno and the cilantro. And then just to give it a little bit more flavor, I always like to squeeze a little bit of lime juice over the top. And you have a lot of different flavors going on. This will transport you right to Jamaica. Always start with the best ingredients that your budget can afford. Let our food pairings reflect the seasons. Use ingredients that add flavor. Cooking with aromatic vegetables like garlic and onion and shallots and ramps and scallions, sweet and hot peppers, they all add a pungency, they add some spicy flavors and aromas that just add to that pleasure of eating. Peppers can be raw or cooked, fresh, dried, and also smoked. And then of course we have those wonderful herbs and spices that are a wonderful opportunity to add flavor without calories, and they make your dish so much more creative. But think about what else they add: the antioxidants, phytochemicals, and also anti-inflammatory agents. When we talk about herbs and spices, it kind of brings me to the point about the importance of understanding ethnic influences. We all need to be a little bit more culturally respective. But I'll tell you what, the most important thing when you want to learn about a culture, dive in mouth first, because that's when you'll really learn about a culture. As an example of a wonderful ethnic influence, I chose a recipe that I really enjoy. It's Moroccan meatballs. And I'd like to share this. It kind of looks like Italian meatballs, but when you take your first bite, you'll be so surprised. First of all, I took the ground meat, which is, very affordable cut of beef, right? And then we added a bunch of different ingredients, like a little bit of breadcrumbs, some cinnamon, some cumin. Moroccan flavors are very sweet, bold. There's a lot of texture. The surprise ingredient in these meatballs is actually currants. And currants are kind of hard to find, but you can always chop up some dark raisins, which work really well. So I made the little mini meatballs and I sauteed those in a skillet. I wanted to show you though what's very traditional in Moroccan cooking, and that is called a tagine. So a tagine is actually a conical cooking tool that acts almost like a slow cooker, because when you put the conical lid on, basically the steam forms around the lid and it helps to to season and also to soften and make your meat really tender. So what I did was I sauteed it to get a nice sear, which gives you some extra flavor along with those other herbs and spices. And then I added the ingredients. And for the sauce, I used tomatoes and a little bit of tomato paste. So you can see that a lot of these ingredients add flavor and also a little bit of sweetness without being a sweet dish. So after you put the tomatoes in there and all the other spices, then you cook it on a low heat for about 20 minutes. So it's a really fast, quick, and easy meal. And I'd like to show it as a little mini appetizer or even a light snack. And you can certainly add as much or as little sauce as you'd like on that. Now I'd like to show you, if you didn't feel like a tomato-based product and you wanted to use those certain meatballs, instead of adding the sauce, I'd like to show you what you can do with those. Moroccan and Mediterranean cooking, there's a really wonderful recipe called kefta, and it really is just those basic meatballs that I mentioned before that are nicely seared, so you have the wonderful flavor. And I'd like to serve these with a little bit of tzatziki sauce and also some naan bread, which is delicious. And you can also buy it now in a toaster format, which you can just put this in the toaster, and it's just so delicious to have with your wonderful meatballs and tzatziki, which is a very easy dish to make. So I have my yogurt, which is plain unflavored. I grated some cucumber, and I'm going to add that to my Greek yogurt with a little bit of minced red onion and also some fresh chopped parsley, and just give this all a good mix. One thing that I always say when you're cooking is don't be a slave to the recipe. So feel free to use as little or as much as you want to make this your own recipe. If you want a little extra flavor, sometimes I like to add a little bit of lemon zest to give it that extra tang. And you can see here that it makes a lot, but you can use that with your meatballs, and it's also good served with other food as well. So there you have it. I'm going to serve that with my kefta meatballs and a couple pieces of my naan bread, and there's another really good snack idea. These are just some of the common top flavors that you have that really pair well with beef. Using a thermometer is really the only safe way to tell if your beef is done. You cannot go by look, you cannot go by feel. The USDA recommends 145 degrees Fahrenheit for steaks and roasts, and 160 for ground meat, and that's the internal temperature of those particular cuts. What kind of cook are you? Are you a warrior? Are you a kitchen warrior? Any trick is fair game when it comes to getting a meal on the table fast. Practical and straightforward, you go into culinary battle armed with all kinds of ammunition to get food on the table. Or are you an explorer? A real gourmet, always seeking new recipes and twists on old ones. Are you a diplomat? Do you need to please a whole range of tastes and dietary needs? Or are you a coward? Are you intimidated by cooking? Or are you just that procrastinator? At 5 o'clock, you have no idea what's going to be on the table for that 6 o'clock scramble. As a food and nutrition expert, you play in a very important role in empowering people to make healthy choices. Pairing credible nutrition information with a culinary demo is such a great way to do it. Use the Texas Beef Council Culinary Demo Toolkit. It's really great. It's a wealth of information that's going to help you be a success in teaching your clients about beef. Planning is so important, and you can see on this slide, you have got to do your homework when it comes to actually doing a culinary demo. Tie it all together with an inspiring, interesting presentation. Have an introduction to establish your credibility and also build rapport with your clients. You need to focus on healthy and nutritious, but mostly delicious. Take time to explain your cooking method, your recipe talking points, and add the wow factor by highlighting personal experiences, stories, and messages. And you want to close your demo with a hero plate so that they know what it's supposed to look like. Shifting the attitude toward healthy through use of flavor which means seasonal, fresh, bold, regional, ethnic cuisine. Be trend savvy. Know what's going on in the food world. Use messages that inspire. Instead of saying, just use a lean cut of meat, say something like, stir-frying thin strips of lean top sirloin with delicious and colorful vegetables. Instead of saying, use herbs and spices, say, use rosemary sprigs to skewer that wonderful beef tenderloin. Instead of, use more whole grain, say, cook a double batch of quinoa or farro and serve some of that as a bowl with your leftover beef. My takeaway today is be an inspiration. This slide has a lot of really good resources to help you build your culinary credentials. Thank you so much for your attention today. It's been a real pleasure to be here and also to partner with Texas Beef Council.